G'day, good afternoon, and welcome back to EconChat, or as we're calling it for these editions, Budget Chat, name to be determined. But as usual, your hosts, John Humphreys and Gene Tunny. Gene, how you doing?
Excellent, John. Yes, looking forward to our conversation, continuing all of the commentary on the budget. There's, quite a bit in it, and I'm looking forward to hearing your perspectives for sure.
Yeah, and we've also got a great lineup of guests coming in to join us today. We've got Barclay McGain, our usual victim. And we've also, though, got Saxon Davidson coming in from the IPA. We've got Malcolm Roberts from the Senator for Queensland from the One Nation Party. And a bit later, we've got Matt Canavan and perhaps other people dropping in. We'll see if they do drop in.
John, you're breaking up.
It seems to be fixed on my end. Is it?
Yeah, I think it's a bit better now.
I was just saying it's live, and one way we can prove it's live by having some glitch, so that because obviously if we had scripted this properly, we wouldn't be having the glitches. So we're just proving that it's live, unscripted. I know what I'm going to say. I don't know what the others are going to say. We will find out if we agree or disagree, or can find different things in this budget. But we'll see as we go. So we've got them waiting in the wings. So I might hurry up and bring on our first two guests, if you like, Gene, and then I'll throw to you to give the really quick summary of the budget from the intelligent third person angle before the rest of us get all antsy and complain about it. So bringing up the guests here, we have Malcolm Roberts, as I said, Nation Party. We've got Saxon Davidson Institute. Look, hopefully into the thing that's in. Can you hear me?
John, we seem to be having some technical issues with you. I can probably take over until your technical side improves. Thanks everyone for joining us, Saxon and Senator Roberts. Good to see you again. What we saw in the budget last night was, there's all of the excitement about the surplus for this current financial year. Now, arguably, it's not large enough to deal with inflation. And what we're seeing is that the budget is going into deficit next financial year and for the financial years beyond that. And the centerpiece of the whole budget is this cost of living package. There's an additional $9 billion in spending beyond what was already in there. So we learned about the $300 per household, not means tested. So there's a bit of controversy about that. And then there are various industry policy things. There's the Future Made in Australia program, where they're becoming very interventionist, the whole mission economy, this idea of Mariana Mazzucato that there needs to be a mission for your economy. So, Jim Chalmers has crafted a budget very much in that mold. And it's a big departure from, say, the Hawke and Keating years. So it's interesting in that perspective. So with that background, can we start with you, Senator Roberts? What are your broad thoughts on the budget that we saw last night?
The one line that I'd use to summarise it is that they're trying to look good, not do good. It really is just a matter of covering up and putting bells and whistles on a pig, actually, or lipstick on a pig. It really is a disgraceful budget. Yesterday, Senator Wong and Senator Walsh from Victoria, I think Senator Walsh is, they both said the words that they used were, the Albanese Labor government's number one priority is cost of living. What the hell are we doing chasing 2050 net zero if that's the case? It's just ludicrous. We also see, as you pointed out, a $9.3 billion surplus, which, given the trade figures in terms of the prices for our iron ore, coal and agricultural products and our metals, is just ludicrously low. Given the fact that so many workers are working 2 and 3 jobs, it's ludicrously low. So we're in real trouble for the future. The other thing is we're in a per capita recession. And the only way they're covering that up and stopping an economy-wide recession, a technical recession, is by high immigration, which is furthering the house, increasing the house prices, rentals, driving inflation. But I've got a few notes here on the government fudging the inflation figures. When they hand out energy and rent relief, that artificially lowers the inflation figures. It artificially lowers the inflation figures. What we've seen in the last 12 months is 15% increase in energy prices as a result of the rent relief, energy relief. That's now appearing as 2%. It's distorting the inflation figures. The second thing is with the rent relief, it's gone from actual figures of 9.5% rent increase in the last 12 months to 7.8%. So it's dropped. But what also happens is that they will cause inflation in other areas because the inflation, the energy costs are not accurately reflected. And we know, well, I'm dealing with at least 3 economists here, and you'll know far better than I do, when you put a subsidy in, you increase prices. And so, and we also know that energy companies are not going to sit by and say, well, they've got another $300. We'll have a lot of that, thank you very much, we'll raise our prices. So we'll see an artificially high increase in energy that'll be masked by the $300 energy relief fund. But what we'll see is an increase in money going to other sectors of the economy that may be not in the basket of goods. Now, it's a pretty wide basket of goods, so I don't really know. But the point is this is inflationary, and you know they need to be very careful what they're doing because they're going to wreck the economy. Energy is the number one cost factor in so many areas of the economy, and what they're doing is destroying that cost with 2050 net zero. Excuse me.
Okay, thanks for your perspective, Senator Roberts. Look, I think that point about this artificial or mechanical or arithmetical reduction in inflation, I think that's a good one. And there's been a lot of commentary from not just me or other and economists who are more sort of on the sort of classical liberal side of things. It's from mainstream. It's from people like Chris Richardson, etc., all sort of pointing to the fact that ultimately this is an expansionary budget, one which could have inflationary consequences. So I think that's a good point. John, you're back. Do you have any follow-up for Senator Roberts or for Saxon? A question for Saxon?
Well, I heard half of that. I'm not sure what you said in my absence, so I don't. Apologies if I'm contradicting or just repeating anyone. I know both of you guys mentioned the budget balance. I've been following budgets since 2000 when I went to work at Treasury, when I worked in the budget policy division. The budget balance that everyone focuses on every year except the last 2 years is the budget that's coming. For this year, it would be 24-25. Right, so the 23-24 budget was last year. All of this commentary is relevant for last year. This year, the budget is in $28.3 billion deficit. And that's how the budget balance would have been reported ever since I've started watching budgets, unless the government has a convenient reason to switch the years and the median is kind of compliant and ignorant and just goes along with it. So this idea that this budget has a surplus, last year's budget had a surplus. Correct. This year's budget is in quite a significant deficit and for no really good reason. So this is not the time of the cycle where you would expect a large deficit. So that's one of my points. I'm sure I'll have more later. I can stick around. Saxon and Malcolm can't, so I'll try not to take up too much of the stage. Saxon, I don't know if you've already given your hot take, but if you haven't, I said before we went live, by the way, I mentioned that I found this budget somewhat boring. And Saxon gave the response that all budgets are interesting, so I must be wrong. So Saxon, how is this budget interesting?
Well, this budget is interesting because it actually lays bare the lack of a productivity agenda that the current government have. You cannot deal with inflation and the anemic economic growth that we are currently suffering unless you have a productivity agenda, because rising tides lift all boats. That is actually how you deal with the cost of living, not with handout after handout, inflationary spending after inflationary spending. And the lack of a productivity agenda is really laid out with this protectionist future made in Australia policy. It is shoveling money essentially shoveling money out of our other industries to pick winners and to put into the production of solar panels and other subsidised green energy policies. Senator Roberts was correct that a lot of our productivity issues can be solved by removing the policy of net zero emissions by 2050. this government repeatedly over-regulates and overburdens our most productive industries, that being mining, agriculture, gas, coal, iron ore, and then get them to basically create these previous to surpluses. But they're not structural surpluses. They're actually, we have entrenched deficits, which the government is hiding behind the political euphemism, unavoidable spending. Besides servicing the debt and national defence, I don't believe there is actually ever such a thing as unavoidable spending. But I'll leave it there because I know we're short for time, but we can sort of go on from there.
Saxon, can I ask about your productivity agenda? So you identified you think energy is one of those areas you'd be against all of these net zero emission policies to get to that target. Is there anything else in your productivity agenda?
Well, I'd reverse a lot of the industrial relation laws that have been passed in the past couple of years, particularly because we actually got a worker shortage. It is actually counterintuitive to make our labour laws more rigid than they currently are, especially when they were already rigid before this current government entered power in May 2022. For example, there are bountiful of red tape and tax laws that apply to Australians who wish to work but cannot, such as Australian veterans, pensioners and students on the youth allowance. People receiving those benefits face a tax rate as high as 66% starting July 1 thanks to the stage 3 tax cuts. And that's because their benefits and their combined benefits and income is automatically bound to the lowest tax threshold. But also, if a pensioner, for example, if they work a day and a half on minimum wage, they're all of a sudden caught by a 50% taper rate to their benefits, which means they pay, starting July 1, a 66% effective marginal tax rate for working. This is why only 3% of pensioners are currently in the workforce, and there was no plan to address this in this current budget. When IPA Research looked at New Zealand and their equivalent tax system, where pensioners are not accountable under the same tax rate, they actually pay a minimum tax rate of about 10.5% should they choose to work on their combined pension and their income. And our research found that this was the major reason why they haven't suffered a worker shortage crisis since COVID. Our worker shortage and productivity sort of solution is actually mass migration. And it simply hasn't worked. We still have a worker shortage. And as Senator Roberts alluded to, we're in a per capita recession. The pie is getting larger, but the slice of the pie is getting smaller.
Right. Okay.
So,
John, unless you've got any...
Does that, Malcolm, mean that you're just about to be called away to the Senate, that ringing in the background?
No, that's the House of Reps.
The wrong team.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the so-called tax cuts, they're not tax cuts, Saxon, they're tax changes, because the law was actually changed by the Morrison government. But even that is a furphy, because a few weeks ago I introduced an amendment, and when the tax changes were legislated by Albanese, I introduced an amendment to introduce bracket creep, nullify bracket creep, to end bracket creep. And both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party said, "Oh, we're in favour of that," but they didn't vote for it. And then David Sharma, a few weeks later, just spoke in his first speech in the Senate and said he's in favour of eliminating bracket creep. But none of them, they'll all talk about it, but they won't do it. I think in this budget, correct me if I'm wrong with the economists in the room, but I think there's a $25 billion increase in tax revenue, mainly due to bracket creep. I think it's even been identified as due to bracket creep. I know that the tax cuts, as Saxon called them, are going to be nullified by bracket creep over the next 4 years to the tune of $38 billion. So there's just some figures that I remember. So we're trying to get rid of bracket creep, but everyone talks about it, but only we do something about it, and the others won't do anything about it.
Yeah. There's been some...
Can I give some numbers on the bracket creep? Look, it jumps around from year to year. So showing what the bracket creep is in 1 year might be a bit misleading. But if you look over the last 20 years, the bracket creep, the amount that revenue grows that isn't explained by income growth and population growth, is about 10 billion a year. It turns out that the stage 3 tax cuts, if measured properly, would reduce revenue by about 10 billion in that year. So the stage 3 tax cuts were a good thing, a good start. They paid us back for 1 year of bracket creep. We've had pretty consistent bracket creep for the last 20 years. So we need 19 more tax cuts to give us back that money for bracket creep. And Malcolm, you're absolutely right about the major parties. They know, the hardheads in the parties, they know that the only way they normally ever get close to balancing a budget is they secretly slug us with this hidden tax.
It's a stealth tax.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so they probably both know it's the wrong thing to do, that ideally you should index tax brackets to not have the bracket creep. But the political incentive for them is diabolical. So I'm glad you're in there pushing them. We need to keep pushing them. We're going to rotate the people soon. So Saxon, you're going to be on the chopping block. But I want to go back to you. First, I totally agree with you on the productivity side of things. And that's one of the things this budget screamed, is that they're out of ideas on productivity. But can I ask you a two-part question then? One, and this will be difficult, and I didn't give him any warning for this, so it's okay if it's too difficult. Can you find something nice to say about this budget? And then secondly, after that, after I pull teeth and try to get you to say something nice, then your final thoughts wrapping up and what it means going forward.
Well, I suppose it's not really, it's more of a neutral thing, is that it was a surplus, but the surplus actually provides the imperative to run a deregulation agenda. We know that this surplus has basically been serviced by our industries that provide royalties and tax, as I mentioned before, coal, iron ore, gas, agriculture, and this actually provides the reasoning, if they even needed even more reasoning, that we need to deregulate and allow these industries to thrive in our economy. And this deregulation includes getting rid of things like the safeguard mechanism, getting rid of net zero by 2050, and make licensing more flexible for Australians. What it means moving forward, as I stated, that we need to have a serious discussion about economic productivity, what we can do, we need to deregulate, we need to get rid of net zero, we need to actually start having our economic growth being driven by people, by businesses, and not by endless mass migration. In the Hawke-Keating-Howard 1990s, only about a third of our economic growth was driven by population growth. In the 2023 financial year, 85% of our economic growth was driven by population. We are simply not a nation that is driven by business anymore. It's driven by red tape and government, and they are servicing that red tape and government by just bringing mass migrants basically into the country.
Very true. Although I think for the last year, it was actually more than 100% of our GDP growth was caused by population, because our population the GDP per person was going backwards. Well, if I can ask Saxon, and of course, feel free to nod and smile and then swear at me once you're off air. But there wasn't a surplus this budget year. I don't think we should allow them to trick us with their words. The media goes along with it. Let us not go along with it and say, oh, you're talking about last year's news. Fascinating. Let's do a history channel someday. But by the way, today's news is a $30 billion deficit.
No, absolutely. I understand that point, and I agree. But when the unfortunate problem with the media cycle is that people unfortunately look at you and say, but everyone's saying it's a surplus. So that's the unfortunate part of the media cycle. But I completely agree that moving forward, it's deficit after deficit after deficit after deficit for at least the next 10 financial years, according to this budget.
Yeah. John, before we rotate the guests out, could I ask Malcolm, what does he think is going to happen in the Senate? Is there any...
Well, just before you do that, I wasn't going to rotate Malcolm out yet. I was just going to get Barclay in here too. So
okay. To go though.
Oh, is it? Okay, then go ahead.
25 past.
Yeah.
Right. Quick question, Gene?
Yeah. Are you able to just give us a quick rundown on what do you think will happen in the Senate, Malcolm? Do you think there'll be any changes to the budget, or will it go through unimpeded?
I can't assess that because I haven't talked to many people. There are a lot of people whinging about the budget, but some of that is just grandstanding. It's hard to say, Gene. One thing I must say is that for the third budget in a row, the Treasurer and the Prime Minister have failed to compliment and thank the agricultural sector and the mining sector, because our country would be in deep doo-doo without them. That's the only thing that's saving this country. And we have got to do, as Saxon said, we've got to engage in structural changes to our economy, because we're becoming a basket case. We're on the road down well and truly. And it didn't just start with Morrison and the Reserve Bank driving high inflation. with a lot of cash, $500 billion worth of cash thrown out around the place. It's being entrenched now by Chalmers, who has got no clue what the hell he's doing.
So you did say that you had to leave now, and so thank you for sticking around as long as you have. I was wanting to come to you with actually the question about Saxon's point on productivity and your take on that, but I think you preemptively gave your take on that in your last comments there. But it does seem to me like the big missing part of the puzzle that the major parties don't talk about. Well, once a year they say productivity and quickly go about buying another vote.
Well, John, I don't think Chalmers is aware of what you're talking about just there. I don't think he's got a clue. You look at his opus on the economy, 6,000 words. It was all double speak and all hype and buzzwords. That's all it was. There was nothing of substance in that when it was released, 12 months ago, last year. I don't think he knows what he's doing. And this budget is all about, the same with the Albanese Labor government and to some extent Morrison's government, it's all about looking good, not doing good. Just fooling and conning the media and conning the people. That's all.
Yeah, and it seems the media enjoys being conned because they might have a horse in the
See you
race.
later. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator Roberts.
Thank you very much. Now, apologies, Barclay, for keeping you waiting as well. You show up diligently, and then I boot you to the background. Just it doesn't look as good with 5 people on the stage. But we've got you now as the replacement for Senator Malcolm Roberts. So that's big shoes to fill. Barclay, you've been listening along to everything we've been saying so far. What have we got wrong or right, or what are we missing?
Well, g'day everyone, and hello listeners. I think it's really important that when we assess this budget, you've got to look at there's so much to break down and talk about. So one of the big things that we got exposed about a week ago that was particularly relevant to me and a lot of the students that I see every day at university is the fact that they're going to pause the indexation of HECS. And I think that'd be interesting to break down because, we've now have a situation where we've got $75 billion of unpaid HECS in this country. And there's no mechanism for which we're able to repay that. All of those loans are forgiven when people eventually die and they're never able to repay those HECS amounts. And it's not clear that freezing the indexation will do and it's not like those academics, we then withdraw the money that we paid them or that we can somehow get rid of inflation. Indeed, as much as the government says they're tackling inflation, we still see wages stagnating or inflation still continue to grow up and go up, and we still see cost of living pressures mounting. So that was one of the things that stuck out for me. But another thing that I also found interesting is, apparently, if you're a billionaire, you don't deserve any kind of tax concession or tax handout unless your name is Andrew Forrester, because he seems to get all the tax concessions in the world through his company, Fortescue Metals and green hydrogen. I think Saxon pointed it out before that, the government, of course, as we know, has drunk this Kool-Aid of net zero. And Malcolm Roberts touched on the point, well, if this truly was a cost of living budget, why are we going down this path of net zero by 2050? So, gents, so far I think you've hit the nail on the head, but I'm keen to unpack it a little bit more and see, I suppose, how the people are going to receive this, because obviously this is looking like an election year budget. Whether we have an election indeed this calendar year or it's within the next 12 months, there's a good chance this will be an election budget. And I think the elephant in the room is how it will be received by people. And I know, Saxon, you spoke about the impact of the media here. It's unreal seeing, whether it's the AFR or whether it's News Corp breaking into, hyperbole on either side of how we should take this budget. Is it a sensible one or is it reckless? So I think, we're seeing arguments on either side, and it depends how it can be spun.
Yeah.
I wanted to get back to the politics in a bit. I thought, if Saxon doesn't have long with us, I did want to see if we could initiate an argument. Or maybe it's not an interesting thing to argue about. I wanted to make my case for why this is a boring budget. And then you guys tell me why I'm wrong. The headline are tax cuts that were legislated years ago and we've known about for months. So that's not a headline. Then the next headline is a budget surplus that doesn't exist and was the budget from a year ago. So, all right, that's great. And then they've got their big pitch for an energy rebate and rent relief to put downward pressure on interest rates. So that's a story. And the richest ledger of business and state, sort of Jim Chalmers, Xi Jinping, Benito Mussolini model of the economy. But even that, they've got $3 billion. It's nearly all off the Ford estimates. or hidden from the budget. So even their big showpiece is not really in this budget year. So it seems to me like there is a lot of fanfare because a lot of the media and the opposition, the government all has to say something big is happening. But nearly every one of the headlines aren't a headline as far as I can tell. So that's me being a black pill, or maybe just the downer here. Saxon, what am I missing?
Oh, look, I think you're missing quite a lot, John. I mean, I think this is quite a consequential budget. I mean, I wouldn't be comparing Chalmers to Xi Jinping or to whoever else you did quite yet. I mean, maybe Attlee. I mean, I think we're talking about the sort of post-war, semi-socialist governments of Attlee, et cetera, where they wanted to take over the commanding heights. I mean, I think we're going back towards that, maybe not full-on communist, but certainly a greater role for government in the economy than we've seen. So I think this is where he's really implementing it. And it's also, this is his big play. I mean, this is his big play for the leadership. If he pulls this off, he's going to be seen as a political genius. I mean, he's got this really clever way of, aren't I so clever? I'm going to bring down CPI arithmetically. And hopefully that convinces Michelle Bullock to cut rates later in the year or just before the election. So look, he's making a big play. This is his play for the leadership. I think he could be too clever by half for the reasons we've, alluded to already. But yeah, I think this is a very consequential, it's a stark break from the past, from previous, recent, from the Rudd administration or certainly from Hawke Keating. It's a big change.
Can I just clarify that I don't think Xi Jinping is a communist. I think he's a different sort of non-capitalist, but that's a different issue. Sorry, Saxon.
I think I agree with Gene. I think this is an outline for the vision for the future of how Jim Chalmers or perhaps even Anthony Albanese views it. Where this is rethinking. This was all in his essay that he wrote about 18 months ago. This is a rethinking capitalism, a vision for the future. It's no mistake that when the Future Made for Australia policy was announced, that Albanese referenced the different models from overseas, the IRA, the European Economic Defence Strategy. Same with the Japanese economic security idea, the ESPA Act. Whereas the Japanese say it's rethinking capitalism, it's a new way of capitalism. And this is actually how Jim Chalmers views it as well. This is a vision for the future budget. This is why it's an interesting budget. I do have to leave soon, but I'll leave it at that. It's a vision for the future. This is his vision for the future.
If you have to leave soon, I take that as not immediately solved. One last question, if you'll indulge me. His vision for the future, but why is it wrong? If we need all these investments and the money's lacking and we need to go in a direction, what's wrong with this policy, the Future Made in Australia?
Well, because we've seen it before. This is, the 1970s protectionist policies have gone back to the future. Like, we've seen it before. It entered the era of stagflation. And then that's how the great economic free thinkers emerged in the 1980s. We've seen this happen before. We've seen this movie before. And when productivity is such a low, and productivity growth is so low, and private investment is so low in the economy, as I said before, rising tides lifts all boats. There are going to be plenty of Australians left behind in this new capitalist net zero future. And we know this because, no matter how much more green energy is brought into the market or into the energy grid, electricity bills are still up, power bills are still up, people are still suffering. This new vision is not a vision that is sustainable. And what actually concerns me more is the idea that, after this election, we might be experiencing a very unstable government, which could actually bring forward these policies further to the left if they are in cohorts with the Teals and the Greens.
That is a very good point as well. So thank you very much for sticking around as long as you have. I appreciate your time, Saxon, and thank you for the commentary and for the depressing analysis of what we just had in front of us.
Thank you. Good to see you guys.
So, by the way, if you're listening at home, please give this a like, give this a share. So the likes and the shares help the algorithm, help other people get in the room, and then we can chat. If you are watching along at home, feel free to pop in a comment, and we'll get to them when we when we notice them sometimes. Apologies, Alex. I didn't get to this one at the time. Bracket creep is completely ignored by common folk. Whoever used to live well is doing it tough, treated like they're doing well. Can anyone explain it in detail? Well, explaining it in detail would take on the short version is your pay's going up. One reason is your pay's going up because of inflation, right? So everything you get paid $10, you get paid 10% more, but everything costs 10% more. So what we'd say in real terms, you're not richer. Yes, your pay went up in a dollar amount, but all the prices went up in a dollar amount. So if you had $100 and everything cost $100, or you have 110 and everything costs 110, you're no better off, right? You're not living a better life. So you're not richer in a real term. But what happens in that situation is you do get pushed into higher tax brackets. So you're not any richer, but you're paying more tax as an average of your income. So that's what we mean by bracket creep. It really hurts in times of high inflation like the last couple of years. And it allows the government to secretly raise the average tax rates without having to admit that they're raising any tax rates. So that's what we're looking at with bracket creep. Barclay, what else have you got for us?
Yeah. Well, I know you spoke before, John, about finding some kind of sense of positive, and I wanted to get both of your opinions on this topic. The NDIS, obviously, it's been a thing that governments dare not slash or touch or cut. Go ahead, John.
I apologize, Barclay. I just asked you a question and immediately cut you off, just like our usual conversations. You must be sick of it. But
That's all right. That's all right. Yeah.
I just saw that we had Matt Canavan enter the back of the studio.
Oh, brilliant. Here we go.
I know he's on a very short amount of time, so I wanted to drag him kicking and screaming into the room. Senator, how are you?
I'm good, John. Nice to be with you here and all of you.
You're good, even despite the joys and sorrows of last night?
Well, mate, there are more important things in life than the budget. I'm pretty lucky. Got a great wife, good kids, pretty good kids. Sometimes they're naughty, but so no, I can't complain, mate. I can't complain. We live in a great country. But look, I think we're in for a wild ride economically over the next year. The government has no plan to get down interest rates, to get down inflation. It's just spend. And we keep as a nation deferring the tough choices, I think, that are necessary. And that's just going to mean tough times are going to continue for longer than they need to.
Yeah, you just missed Saxon Davidson from the IPA, just left the room a few minutes before you got here. But his main takeaway was that it was remarkable how silent the budget was on productivity. And I'm racking my brain now. Did Chalmers say the word productivity once in his speech? Not that saying it would have helped.
So I didn't. I sort of was half listening to it because I'm always half listening to it while I'm actually going through the budget papers and looking at the detail, because the spin obviously doesn't reveal much to you in the speech. But I don't think he did. And look, that's probably not that unusual. Obviously, productivity is a bit of a technical economist term that often is shied away from here in Canberra. But I think the big issue here is that with inflation being the number one issue, cost of living is the number one political issue, people are struggling. The only sustainable way we can get that down without crashing the economy is to increase our productivity, is to increase the economic frontier. So however you want to describe it, whether you don't want to use the term productivity or not, you need to find a way as a government to increase your economic potential. If we don't do that, the only way inflation is going to come down is if we have a recession, like a recession we had to have, and I don't think anyone wants that. So that is a big problem that you've identified there. The government doesn't really have a strategy. I mean, I think they would say, oh, all these green energy investments are going to do that. Well, yeah, good luck with that. I don't think it's going to do much.
That was going to be my facetious comment at that point. Gene, you got any?
Yeah, Matt, thanks for joining us. You talked about the need to make hard choices or hard decisions to repair the budget. Do you have anything in mind? Where do you see as the priority areas for doing that?
Well, overall, it's government spending. Obviously, it's running at far too high a level. I mean, keep in mind when this government came to power in 2022, the pre-election forecast outlook had government spending for next financial year to be at I think 660 billion. Let me check that figure. I did a list the other night, but I'll just make sure I get the figures right for you guys. So yeah, government spending was going to be $62.3 billion in 24-25. Last night, government spending is now running at a projected $726.7 billion. So, a good a good $65 billion extra than what was predicted just 2 years ago. And keep in mind, 2 years ago, we're still coming out of the COVID pandemic. There was a lot of elevated spending as a result of that, and a little bit unclear how quickly things would recede. Really, over the last 2 years, COVID went away quicker than probably anybody thought. Notionally, then we should have been able to get government spending back down. But as all of you probably know and appreciate, government spending is a bit like a ratchet, isn't it? It never really goes down. It just goes up to a certain level and keeps getting higher. And so in terms of then you're going to ask me, what would you cut from that? Well, the NDIS is a big one. It blew out by another $5 billion last night. There's got to be much more discipline there in what has turned out to be a massively more expensive program. Way, it's like 3 times higher. That's got to be more effort's got to be put there. All of these green energy investments, they shouldn't be there. We shouldn't be doing this. I've tallied up already so far over $30 billion of spending on the net zero agenda. We were all sold this net zero agenda that was going to be almost like free money. Everyone's going to invest in our country. Power prices would come down through green energy. There would be no cost, no price to pay to get to net zero. But in fact, it's costing us an enormous amount of money, and the $30 billion is just what's hitting the public budget. I'll be getting rid of all that. I'll be scrapping a net zero agenda. That's what needs to happen. We need to make those sort of choices. And then outside the budget, we've got to get down regulation, red tape, which there's just no effort to do so right now.
Yeah. And Matt, on the NDIS, what do you think it is? Is it routine? Is it the level of service is just it's well beyond what is necessary, what is essential? Is it do we need means testing of the NDIS? Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, it's a combination of things, but there's probably no doubt that the biggest driver of the cost increase is the increased numbers of participants that are coming into the program. I saw a stat the other day that young boys, I think aged 5 to 7, might have been 4 to 7, young boys, that 1 in 10 of them are going on the NDIS. It's just not right. This is not what was designed for. It was not designed to deal with, say, developmental delays. The large part of this is those designated as autistic, and of course there are some autistic kids that deserve and need significant help and intervention, but there are other autistic children that really don't need this kind of government program to support them and help them. But that's what's happening, and obviously you put a big pot of honey out there with no real strings attached, you're going to attract a whole lot of businesses. And it's not the participants I blame here, it's the businesses that have grown off this. I mean, in my part of the world, every second shop front seems to have an NDIS logo on it. And they're just attracted to this, and they've got a business model to get people through the loopholes, the government regulations into the scheme and on the public tee. And I don't think it's going to be great for those children's development over time to be so reliant on government assistance. And obviously it's something that's almost bankrupting us. It was projected to cost $16 odd billion. It's now well above 40 and potentially going to over $60 billion in the years ahead. We've got to put the handbrake on this.
Yep.
Yeah, who would have thought that if you subsidize something, you get more of it?
Yeah, exactly. Funny. There's been a whole discipline of people warning about these things.
You probably have to say it a bit nicer than I, but I mean, realistically, we've created a massive incentive for parents to suddenly discover a mental health problem with their child. And as soon as parents are significantly financially rewarded for discovering a problem with their child, there has suddenly been, at that point, a massive spike in the problems that these parents find in their children. Now, like you, it's not particularly the parents' fault. This is the incentives that's being given to them by the politicians. And it's
absolutely it's not the parents' fault. And look, I mean, there are obviously degrees of different mental health and other health issues that young children face. It's just a question of what triggers the involvement of huge levels of government support and assistance. And I think we need to keep, the NDIS was designed to help those people in a severe outcome. And there's some good economic rationale for that if you're in that sort of Rawlsian paradox and you don't know how your life's going to turn out, if you ended up crippled or you just can't function, you'd probably want a degree of support. But if you're simply, as I say, have some development delays, a bit different than other children, the level of government support, this level of government support is going to be a cure worse than a disease, because it's going to make you reliant on others, dependent, and it's not going to help you overcome the hurdles that everyone faces in their life. that can be overcome with good parents, good communities, good schools, without the need for a big bucket of money from Canberra.
Well, I have heard also that one of the things you can sign your kid up for is if they don't like to listen to authority. I have a 2-year-old that fits that bill very well, so maybe I need to have a look in and see if
I've got 5 of them.
Can I go back to one thing you mentioned earlier? There's a little factoid for everyone here in the audience at home. The budget, of course, it's not a $9 million surplus. It's a billion. It's a $28 billion deficit. For some reason, everyone in the media and the government wants to only talk about last year's budget, but this is this year's budget now. And this year's budget is a $28 billion deficit. Here's the kicker for you. In this budget year alone, since Labor came into government, they have, this is just policy alone, not variations. They have passed $31 billion of new spending for this budget year. So they've got a $28 billion deficit. They have proactively chosen to, over the last 2 years, introduce $31 billion of dollars impacting the budget just in this financial year. So if they had just done nothing, not spent, it's very hard for a government not to spend, but if they had not spent money for 2 years, we wouldn't actually have a deficit. So you talk about the need to get spending under control. Like, the hard part is cutting, but it's just start with not adding to it.
That's right. I mean, I don't haven't added up the figures in the way you have there. I'm sure you're right. That's just what's been legislative. There is other spending that occurs from the government as well. And there's always this, it's become known as a table of truth. I think Chris Richardson used that, but he's absolutely right. The table in the budget paper is usually buried about page 100, which shows what is the net impact of policy decisions on the budget. And so taking away the changes in commodity prices, the change in unemployment rate, things that are largely outside the government's control, what have they done to influence the budget? And last year's budget added $20 billion of new spending through policy changes in net terms. This year's budget beat that. It was $24 billion. And when you look back, I went back last year and looked back at this table for every budget back to the Howard government. And apart from the COVID years, which are obviously a bit special, with hundreds of billions of dollars in that table in new spending. If you take out those years, this is the biggest spending government since the global financial crisis, since Kevin Rudd decided that we had to go hard, go early, and go households back in the late 2000s. Now, at least Kevin, despite being misguided with that in the end, but at least Kevin had the excuse of dealing with a global economic fallout and the potential need for some degree of stimulus. The last couple of years, we've had a situation, we've had inflation out of control, and every bit of economic advice, and this is one, it's pretty hard to get economists to agree, but every one of them is saying we've got to have some restraint here to try and bring down inflation. Instead, Jim Chalmers has actually been a bigger spending treasurer than anyone in the last decade, anyone going back to when he worked for Wayne Swan and had the GFC to deal with. It's just completely the wrong medicine, like totally the wrong medicine in totally the wrong direction. And it's not surprising, therefore, that inflation is ticking up in Australia, and the Reserve Bank's they've got a hell of a job to do over the next year.
Well, the wrong medicine if you're trying to do the right thing by the economy. Who knows if the goal is trying to get re-elected? Maybe it is a nice medicine. Look, the table you're talking about is the one that I use. I just I don't like the trick people do of adding up 4 years. I think it's at least very misleading understanding of numbers. So I was just looking at particularly this budget year, 32 billion spending with a $28 billion deficit. But yes, that is the table everyone should be looking at. Barclay, you look like you had a question.
It's also, can I just add on that table, they also don't include some things, despite it being the best measure. So say, for example, the government has made a decision to pay for increases in wages for aged care workers and childcare workers. That's not in that table, because the argument is that that's a result of a Fair Work Commission decision and therefore not a policy change, when it was the government's pushed that Fair Work Commission decision. That's costing us at least over $15 billion as well, on top of all that spending.
And then also the off-budget stuff, which everyone kind of ignores because it's off budget. It's hard to see, but the advice being given to financial investors to invest in particular green energy projects, that's all going to come back to bite us, but it's not in the budget. So Barclay.
Yeah, g'day, Matt. Just on that topic of green energy, I know it's obviously a topic you've been very outspoken against, the idea of going to net zero. But I just wanted to ask, just from an outsider's perspective, what is the presence of lobbying and lobbyists in Australia? Obviously, in the 70s and 80s, we kept on hearing about the big coal, big oil, big natural gas. And whenever we think of lobbyists, in the 2010s, we kind of think of those super PACs over in the US. But how big is the green energy lobby here in Australia? I mean, judging by this budget, massive billion-dollar handouts to billionaires like Twiggy Forrest and Fortescue Metals. How big is the green energy lobby here in Australia, and is it growing or is it shrinking?
Oh, it's definitely growing. And look, I mean, it's the biggest form of rent seeking in this country comes from the green energy industry. It's the biggest protection racket we have now. And that's perhaps the most pernicious thing that's been unleashed from this green energy obsession that's existed over the last decade or so in Australian politics, is it has reinvigorated the form of rent seeking we haven't seen since the days that protection was removed in the 1980s. Obviously, back then there was a lot of rent seeking around what tariffs were set on razor blades and washing machines and lots of different things. We got rid of all that, but now again, there's this big potential to make money by convincing a government that you should be back because you meet this target that everyone signed up to for net zero. You don't have to demonstrate that you're generating wealth or you're generating a net economic benefit for the Australian people. You just have to generate that somehow your particular policy prescription can be pushed into this net zero agenda. And so that's why we're seeing this ridiculous expansion of hydrogen investments, where the Labor Party is trying to tell communities in my part of the world that, hey, we're going to put you out of business, we're going to put you out of a job in the coal industry, but you're going to have this hydrogen job to replace it. And it's really absurd, because they talk as if the coal industry is declining and it's going at the back door, and we're really here to help you guys as you're suffering and struggling with the lower coal demand. When everyone on the ground knows that's just totally ridiculous. I mean, these coal towns are just booming right now because there's never been high demand for coal, and so business is really good. And people are looking around going, why do you want to shut us down? I've never made more money. What's going on here? And then they give the money, they give the taxes that are raised from the coal industry to people like Twiggy Forrest, who are convinced that hydrogen is going to be the way. And look, maybe I'm wrong, maybe they're right, but no one's buying hydrogen at scale right now. This is all a big gamble on people's lives, on people's futures, our country's prosperity, because as we can see from the budget, so much of our prosperity comes from the wealth that's generated by iron ore, by coal, by gas. And so if we shut that down early without knowing there's a replacement for it, well, we'll be a lot poorer if things don't turn out.
The gamble point is a good one, because it's if they do go and bet everything on red, if it comes up red, they look like geniuses. The problem is, if the government is sitting there putting all the money on red every year, it's not going to come up perfectly every time. I mean, that's a big risk to be taking with the way we structure an economy. Can I put up? I'm very aware that you don't have much time, Matt. Senator, so let me know if you need to walk out. But I was going to put up a
just
graph.
2 o'clock question time, so I've got about 3 or 4 minutes. Go for it. Yeah.
All right, I just put up this graph that came from the budget papers, budget statement 11, which shows the tax per person adjusted for inflation, and you can see here this is a pretty consistent trend, unfortunately, under all manner of previous leaders. And you see here a large part of this is driven by the bracket creep, which has really stung Australian taxpayers over the last 20 years. But interestingly, if you go to the very end there, you'll see that little dip. That is our stage 3 tax cuts. And you'll see by the end of the graph, they're already gone. I would say, as those who know me would know, I always say, it's time for another round of tax cuts. This one-way upward graph, like you say, the one-way ratchet growth of government, I would say this is a big reason we've had a productivity slump and a per capita recession. Stage 3 was a good down payment on paying us back the bracket creep. But the evidence I would put in this graph says we've got further to go. Gents?
Well, what I'd love to see, I'm happy for others to contribute, but what I'd love to see is the coalition, and a bunch of us are pushing this, is to commit to index the brackets, to index tax brackets. Now, obviously, we're going to have a discussion whether we can afford to go back to the stage 3 tax cuts we promised, the Labor Party promised, and then backed out of. That would be great if we could do that in the short term. But a more structural and longer term change that wouldn't add to inflationary pressures is just to commit the next government to legislate that brackets now will go up with inflation. I mean, pretty much everything else goes up with inflation, the government does. Why shouldn't the tax brackets do the same? That will enforce some discipline on governments. It will stop them being able to lazily rely on this inflation tax, which means that inflation is actually a very good thing for Canberra. As you can see, there are 35,000 more public servants here now than when this government got elected. It's very good business for them, but it's not so great for those Australians who are salary earners, wage earners, who just see themselves get pushed into higher tax brackets from inflation that's caused by their own government.
Well, you have the full support of the ATA on that one. The Australian Taxpayers Alliance indexing income tax brackets, I think, is a wonderful idea. I don't know if the others have any last questions, but
yeah, I've got one, Matt. Senator Canavan, I'd be interested in your thoughts on housing. The government's been criticised for not doing enough there. I mean, we've got a housing crisis. We've got people living in tents all over Brisbane, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is just appalling. I mean, what's your take on what's happened and what's the way forward? I mean, do you have any thoughts on how we can solve this crisis?
Well, I'll say three quick things. Number one, I'll be generous. I'm in a generous mood to the government. I mean, there's not directly a lot the Commonwealth government can do about housing. It's largely a state and local government issue, and they've massively mismanaged the development of land and housing. But the Commonwealth government can't directly change that. Secondly, I say one thing they can do to alleviate things is the migration. We've taken in way too many people, notwithstanding those issues we've got at a planning level. The government is saying now they will halve migration. We'll wait to see if that happens, but that's a big cause of what's happened. They've just lost control of our border in the last couple of years. And look, finally, I'd say, Gene, is look, I do think that the long-term solution here has to be to develop new cities in Australia.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just keep chucking more infrastructure into Sydney and Melbourne and now Brisbane, land's still going to keep going up in value. It's going to price young people out. And this is a hard message to sell to people, but ultimately, if we're going to grow from 25 million to 40 million and more people over many decades, we're going to need new cities. We're going to need more areas of wealth and concentration of people. And there needs to be more focus on that because we are a very concentrated population on the world scale. And that's a big driver, I think, of the fact that we have some of the highest real estate prices in the world. We've got a big country, lots of resources. We probably need to spread out a bit more to give young people a chance in the housing market.
You've got me in furious agreement yet again on that, Matt. By the way, one of the best ways to do that might be if we had a few more states, we'd have a few more state capitals. But,
we need a whole new, absolutely. We need a whole next separate session on new states.
So, Gene, last question.
Oh, that was what I was going to ask you. I agree. I mean, I'd love to see a state of North Queensland, and I mean, if we can have towns.
You'd be moving right there, Gene. It'll be a safe space for all of us. Well, I was going to say conservatives, but you're really libertarians, aren't you? We'll look after you too. We'll be right.
Well, classical liberals.
North Queensland is a pretty liberal place. We're pretty free in that sense of the word. You do what you like in North Queensland.
We are
all right. Have a good one, guys.
Okay.
Thanks, Matthew. Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks,
see you all. Thanks very much. See you. Bye.
I didn't get a chance then to ask. I was going to ask if you could find something nice to say about this budget. It is a hard question. It's a particularly hard question for a politician who's sitting on the opposition benches. I imagine it'd be kind of stretching to get him to answer that. I have one nice thing to say about this budget. Okay. It's a very meek pat on the back, but they did extend the instant asset write-off for small business up to 20,000 for another year. Now, I got 3 complaints with that. They should have extended it permanently. It should apply to bigger businesses than it does, and it should be more than $20,000 per asset they buy. But so I'm complaining that it's too small, but at least it exists. So that's better than them letting that policy expire entirely. So that's half a tick on that front. Jens, did you have anything that you could salvage from this budget?
Yeah, well, I did. I know we were briefly just discussing it before Matt joined, but I think with further reading and then also hearing with what Matt's saying is, they want this optics of, we're trimming the fat. We're trimming the fat when it comes to the NDIS. We're getting rid of dodgy providers. But when you actually break it down, okay, so this is what they've done. They've handed $23.5 million to Services Australia to investigate these fraudulent providers. Now, this seems to me like a kind of small-scale Royal Commission. Royal Commissions, for all we've seen, and we've seen Dr. Scott Prasser, he's spoken at ATA events in the past regarding the efficacy of Royal Commissions. Largely, they're just for the government and their mates in the private sector to go and investigate themselves and act like they're doing something. And I think that's essentially what this Services Australia investigation is going to be. Then you've got another advisory committee. We've got so many advisory committees at a federal and state level now. It's $45.5 million. And the irony of it all is this advisory committee, gents, is about providing more offer and more value for money. And it takes us actually spending $45.5 million to offer more value for money. But better yet, we're offering they're spending actually $240 million to go to better technology. So, like they're saying that they're cracking down, but it looks to me like they're just more so watering this ever-growing monstrosity of a plant that is the NDIS. So, I think we can kind of cut through their spin there that they're cracking down on dodgy providers. It's it's more just more bureaucracy, basically.
I don't know if that counts as a positive thing about the budget.
Well,
but
I thought it could have been, but then I read more information thanks to a good Senator Matthew Canavan, because I love it when they crack down and trim the fat. I think that's often a good thing. But then when you see who it goes to and that kind of thing, and I know we have a lot of conservatives and people who are maybe think they're in favor of small government, but they're all in favor of royal commissions and more committees to crack down on these things. Well, plain and simple, we'll see it here. We'll see what the outcome is. Do we trim the fat on the NDIS with this advisory committee that we've now got? But yeah, I'm not holding my breath.
So I just brought up here the top expenses in the federal budget. So you'll see I wonder if you can see my mouse. So let me know if you can see my mouse here.
I can now. Yep.
All right. So the first one you don't have to worry about. That's just the federal government passing GST onto the states. So that's not actually a spending line item there. The biggest one is pensions. You see nearly $62 billion a year on pensions, rising to $70 billion. That is a mammoth part of the budget and always has been. You'll see here the second biggest part of the budget now. Recently overtook some of the others to get here, is now the NDIS, and the NDIS is closing in. You can see there's 13 billion less here, 9 billion, well, 9.5 billion less there. So NDIS is growing on a trajectory to become the biggest single line item in the budget. You can see here the other big ones: aged care, medical benefits, assistance for hospitals. This gives a bit of an insight as to the difficulty of balancing a budget. It's a lot of people say, they just need to cut spending. And then they mention things that are very cheap and aren't going to balance the budget. The big items that are really blowing a hole in our budget are things that are really hard to deal with, because who wants to try and play around with people's aged pension or disability support or aged care services or your Medicare or hospitals? I mean, these are all third rails in politics. People clear away from nearly all of these, which is why they've been able to grow hand over fist to the point where they're slowly becoming unaffordable for the country. But this is a bit of a wake-up call to those who think you can cut the size of government without making any tough decisions. Eventually, we need a brave politician, because eventually someone has to make a tough decision. So I'll take this one off now, unless you guys wanted to go anywhere else in the budget.
I wanted to actually ask both of your opinions on the topic of the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. I know that was something that I believe was brought in under Kevin Rudd. We've probably had about over a decade now to look closer into that. Obviously, it's a little further down there on that chart you've got there, about $19.7 billion. Gents, in your opinion, how has that fared so far? Obviously, a lot of people, when they think about healthcare overseas, they say, at least we're not like America, where you have to pay 6-7 times the actual market cost of insulin. And thank goodness we have the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. Is it really cracking down on price gouging from pharmaceutical companies on inelastic goods, or is it largely, obviously there it's growing in size, but has it proven to be applicable so far?
Well, I don't think PBS started with Rudd. What PBS is about is, correct me if I'm wrong, Gene, it's a subsidy for expensive medicines that people get regularly. So if something actually costs, say, $200 if you didn't have PBS, then the government picks up $180 of it, and you pay $20 when you go and buy that. So a lot of the drugs you go in and buy from the pharmacy, the cost you're being shown isn't the actual cost of getting the drug. It's been subsidized before it got to you. And I think that system's been around for quite a while. I think the problem with the PBS system is the way they work out the discount. The way they work out the discount, as I understand it, and I haven't looked into it for a few years, takes away some of the price incentive to make a smarter choice about the drug you choose. So they take away some of the role one of the roles of prices is to incentivize people to make better decisions. So I understand their goal was to make the medicines cheaper. You could do that without obscuring the price mechanism quite as much as they do. So that's my complaint on the PBS. Yeah. It's quite esoteric there, so it's not normally a barbecue stopper.
Yeah, I think, Barclay, we might have to come back to this, mate, because it's a big topic. Look, the
Yeah.
PBS does have some buying power. So, because it's such a major buyer of pharmaceuticals, it's able to negotiate very good deals. So there is some truth to that argument that, that's one reason drugs would be cheaper here. But there's also, it is a subsidy, as John was saying. The difficulty is, the US healthcare system is something, we're not going to be able to resolve it today. One of the arguments that's made is that, the Americans end up subsidizing a lot of the pharmaceuticals in the rest of the world because we are able to, exploit the market power of the PBS to get cheaper prices. And so that's one of the reasons that the big pharma has to try and make more money in the States. Now that, that's a difficult one. And I think big pharma probably does have a fair bit of market power and maybe there is exploitation. But look, I think we'll have to have a separate econ chat on that because it's just too big an issue to go into here. Could I just say about PBS, though, I think if you're looking at this budget from an equity perspective, then what they did in terms of, freezing those co-payments for pharmaceuticals for seniors or for pensioners for 5 years, that's a good thing from an equity perspective. It's a lot better than this just blanket $300 to every household, not means tested for electricity bill rebates, which I think is very bad policy.
I was just I've done that successfully now. Bring up the tax for people's viewing pleasure. The different types of taxes and how much each one raises. I know there's a lot of information on here. If you can see, the blue line gives you the budget year, so we'll just stick with the blue column, and you can see down the bottom here. This is the total amount of money the government brings in. About 700 billion, 700,000 million dollars they bring in. Of that, a significant portion is the income taxes. Brings in 500 of that. And this goes to the point about how Australia is so reliant on income taxes. The other big one there is GST. Of course, the federal government passes that on to the states. And all of the other taxes combined here, you've got petrol is 7 plus 17 plus 2. Tobacco tax, thank you again to the smokers. We appreciate you and what you do for the budget.
And the spirits drinkers too that raise, there's as much or more, there's more raised. Have I got that right? From spirits, the excise on spirits than on beer. So that's
yes, it's 2.8 on beer, 3.6 on spirits, and 1.8 on that's probably wine. Other alcoholic beverages are those not exceeding 10% value by volume of alcohol, excluding beer, brandy, and wine. Where's the wine equalization tax in here? Ah, here it is. Here's wine. Thank you, wine drinkers. You're giving us $1 billion of your hard-earned as well towards the budget. So I appreciate it.
Wine's arguably preferentially taxed, isn't it? Because of the way that it's taxed, and therefore that incentivizes people to drink the cheap, the goon, so to speak, the the boxed wines.
We call it Chateau de Cardboard in this household. But yes, but notwithstanding all of these wonderful citizens donating their hard-earned through their tobacco and alcohol tax, what this does show you is, look, the diesel tax, 17, it's bigger than most other ones. Look at income tax. That's total income tax, right? So that includes company. But if you just look at individual income tax, you can see the disproportionate weighting in our income system, in our tax system towards income taxes. And realistically, you should include the company tax because that flows through to the to the individuals anyway. So you'll sometimes hear people saying we need to reweight our tax system. I push back against that. I think we just need to cut the tax level. So I don't think we need to necessarily increase consumption taxes more on this assumption that the government is already the right size and we shouldn't shrink it. But just looking at these numbers, it really brings home how much we are reliant on income taxes in this country. And you can understand income taxes. We all don't like paying income taxes to the degree that we do have an income. So we don't like it at a personal level. And we kind of think of it in that political sense of, I don't like paying it. If they'll just cut my tax, that's fair or that's good for me. Just economically speaking, in terms of what's right for the country, productivity hasn't grown for 8 years. I mean, it's gone up and down a little bit, but we're at the same level of productivity that we were 8 years ago. And that explains one of the reasons why we've been in a per capita recession for the past year. But even notwithstanding the last year, an 8-year stretch of no growth in productivity, in labor productivity, according to the national accounts, is actually the longest stretch of a productivity slump in the ABS history, in their recorded history. You go back to when they started recording this, there's never been a longer period of stagnation of productivity. And this is the serious problem, as Saxon and Davidson said earlier in our conversation. Productivity is missing from this. I noticed that Senator Matt Canavan said that, in Canberra, they've learned not to say the word productivity. I think they've also learned not to think about productivity, because it doesn't occur to me that they're actually making any progress on this. But productivity has slumped for a long time. Taxes keep going up, as I showed before with this wonderful graph. And these taxes are disproportionately weighing on income taxes. And what that does is it creates not just a disincentive to work. That's what most people look at. That's not really the main part of the story, right? That happens a little bit, but that's not the main part of the story. It's a disincentive to invest. It's a disincentive to start a business. It's a disincentive to take a risk, to do something dangerous, to come up with a new quirky idea. You come up with 10 new ideas, 9 of them probably suck. You have to be willing to come up with new ideas, and there has to be a payoff for the ones that work. But if we are taxing the bejesus out of income, we are putting a downward pressure on that willingness to invest and innovate. And investing and innovating are the only long-term things that can drive productivity. And we're in a productivity slump. So again, of course, it should be unsurprising that the chief economist at the Australian Taxpayers Alliance would once again be talking about cuts. But I'm not saying this because I work here. I'm working here because I already believed it. I think the evidence backs up. If we don't do something about these punishing levels of income taxes soon, we can't really expect to return to a good prosperity path.
Yeah, but John, I take your point and I agree with you, but there are others in the community, and there is this view that, well, we actually need more assistance. And I was on a panel on ABC Nightlife last night with Cassandra Goldie from ACOS, and she's saying, well, look, we've got this lowest or second lowest rate of unemployment benefits in the OECD, and so people are effectively in poverty if they're unemployed. We need to substantially boost that. But she recognises that, okay, there's not the money for it at the moment. We need to lift taxes. So there's a whole group, there's a big constituency that's pushing the other way. How do you sort of push back against that? Because you're right that, look, we'd have a much more productive economy, we'd be much more efficient. But there are others out there who are saying, well, okay, we're willing to make that equity efficiency trade-off, as Arthur Oaken called it, the big trade-off, because they think we actually need to do more with the budget to support people. And I'm just putting that out there because that's what they're going to come back with. You're just these pointy-headed economists. How do we respond to that?
I like that you raised this. It's good to throw each other difficult questions. Look, a couple of things. Firstly, I don't think there's any lack of awareness of that narrative in the public. I think that narrative dominates everywhere in the media. Yeah. And everywhere in politics. Everyone is very quick to say, can we get you another handout? Pour this person, give them something. Pour this person, give them something. And maybe it's true. Putting that aside, my first point is it's not like that narrative is missing. The narrative of we have higher tax rates than ever before in history, and that taxes are stifling productivity and productivity is in a slump, and that's the reason we can't have wage growth or real wage growth. That narrative is missing. What we're saying is nearly non-existent in the ABC. And quite frankly, most of the other major media outlets. So that's one point I would make. And then in terms of once the two narratives, if they both got equal space, which one's true? I think you'll find. I think I've heard a stat similar to what you just mentioned there. I think you'll find they say something along the lines as a percentage of the average income or something like that. I believe our welfare payments, our direct transfers to low income people is the second highest in the world. And that means the second highest in the world through all of history. Ever since, humans walked into a house and created any country, we've got the second highest transfer. And mess up those numbers. So when she says we've got lower levels, I think she's doing it proportionally, and we're a rich country. So we need to check into her numbers there. I'm a bit skeptical. Thirdly, I'd say if we actually care about the poor people in this country, at what point do we notice the more we subsidize poverty, the more poverty we get? Now, I know it sounds counterintuitive. You think, poor person, give them money, they'll be rich. We've tried that. most of the Western world has tried that. And we didn't just try it for a year. We've tried it and repeated it every 5 years for 50 years straight. We've got some data points here, right? If you incentivize productivity, you get more productivity. If you incentivize more reliance on government, you end up getting more reliance on government. So is the goal to be able to say, oh, look, I'm handing money to someone. Oh, yes, I know it won't help them, but it'll help me get reelected. Is that the goal? Or are we going to stop and pause and go, look, I know that if I go down this path, I might look like the bad person, but I might actually be able to help someone. And that's very difficult in politics. If you give those two options, then I know what most people will choose. That's, well, I've got to sound nice. Doesn't matter. At some point, alternate narrative again. But it's that alternative narrative makes the thing you should actually go not doing good. And but as I've seen is people in jobs and getting around them is this way to bring most people out of poverty.
Yeah, we just lost you for a minute, but I think what you were saying is that the best way to get people out of poverty is to get them into employment, to get them a job. So I think that's a good point.
There's another point here that there are some people that are always going to require help. Now that's a truism. And then there's the next question after that. It doesn't just say, oh, somebody's going to need help, so we need a massive centralized government that takes away our freedom and destroys prosperity. That A doesn't necessarily go straight to B there. I mean, there's an intermediate step. What is the best way to help people? And I would argue that history's been replete with examples that local community, families, church groups, whatever civil society groups you can get into, have a far better track record of actually helping real people, not just stamping them a welfare check and telling them to piss off, and then they go live under a tree, and then you go home and you feel like you're the good person. But local community that people are actually engaged with and are part of. So and one of the problems here is you say, oh, that's, that sounds nice and all. How do you do it? Or more often I hear, well, why don't you do both? Local community groups, the family cohesion, the church groups have declined in exact proportion to the growth of the welfare state. The welfare state is to some degree replacing, crowding out, killing off these community groups. And the government's able to say, oh, we have more access to money because we can just, tax the bejesus out of everyone else and destroy productivity and prosperity. And yes, they can do that, get more money, and they can hand out more money, but they hand it out in such a way that they're not really solving the underlying problem. So again, I go back to, do you want to help people, or do you want to look like you're helping people while you're doing a radio interview against Gene Tunny on ABC?
Very good, John. Very good. I'm going to have to leave in a minute, I think, but go ahead, Barclay.
Yeah, no worries, Jim. Well, maybe before you go, I actually wanted to maybe tack on to a bit of an interesting discussion that Saxon briefly brought up. I know the IPA has, well, maybe not changed their tune on this, but perhaps come more outspoken on this issue, and that is immigration. Now, I know that's not necessarily the overarching topic that particularly Jim Chalmers wants to talk about in this discussion, but and Matt Canavan also mentioned it before that, conservative versus libertarian. It seems to me that would be an issue where often they would disagree. And I wanted to throw it both to both of you, gents. Where do we stand on immigration, and whether immigration, which is largely increased under Labor, is necessarily wanted, desired, or is that kind of like this, I guess, pipe dream that we have of a big Australia with more and more people with sky high prices?
Yeah, okay, Barclay. I'll take that. I'm not sure it's necessarily all the Labor Party's fault, because I think these policy settings were in place during the coalition too. So I don't think it's necessarily one side's worse than the other. We've just got a university sector that's addicted to foreign students, and I mean, we had student visa rules which were just too generous for a while, and it's creating all sorts of problems. So I mean, I think governments have to make decisions in the interests of Australians, in the national interest, and I think, given there are these external costs that are imposed on the rest of the community from a very high rate of immigration, I think it's legitimate to want to reduce that. So without necessarily saying it's all Labor's fault, I would say that the government, the current government has been caught unawares by this massive growth in student numbers in particular, and then family who come over for all these temporary migrants. It's been a huge part of the problem, and we need to do something about it. So it's good that they are forecasting a reduction in net overseas migration, but arguably it has to be a bigger reduction.
Yeah, on conservatives versus libertarians, I would say at this point in time, we're all just on the team of skeptical of centralized government power. So that's the overarching theme. That notwithstanding, in the libertarian world, there is a case against open borders, and that is in the instance where you have a welfare state, and even some would say in an instance where you have a fairly robust democracy. With a welfare state, you can't just invite everybody in and then pay them welfare, right? So you could let them come in and not take welfare, which I think would be an interesting idea. That would do is also self-select for immigrants. If you're coming over, but never going to get welfare, then you would only come over here if you knew you're going to be productive enough to add enough to society, get paid enough to be able to live well. So self-selecting against the sort of people who would end up on welfare. But yeah, so that's an abstract point. He said, as Gene said, this issue is tied up quite a bit with the higher education system. And I have a rather fine view on that. And we start having the system of foreign students coming in to prop up our university system, I think might be a whole approach to education and immigration that we need to rethink from the ground up. Is my internet been going down again, gents?
Yeah, every now and then. Yeah, it's a little patchy. Yeah.
Yeah, just for this, it was working perfectly until 2 minutes to 1 o'clock.
It's always the way.
So you want to do a roundup then? Final thoughts? Anything we missed? Anything you wanted to say? Anything you saw but didn't get a chance to mention yet?
Well, I wanted to just briefly segue this into the federal election discussion. So obviously we do believe this will be the last budget until the federal election. If you're Peter Dutton, how would you be spinning this in a way that benefits your side, do we think, Gents? Obviously, we spoke last session when we spoke about the Victorian budget, about how one thing we want to see opposition leaders is not, demean the other government for, cuts and chaos, but instead say, well, good on the government for savings. And I think, Gene, you pointed out last time that one reason why John Howard got a lot of credibility was because he was like, we respect the government and we think that they did the right thing here. And he earned a lot of credibility from the public there. And that steered the conversation to, instead of calling it a cut, call it a savings measure. And I don't know, I think it'd just be an interesting discussion. This is maybe more a comment, same as an open-ended question of how does Peter Dutton respond to this? And do we think he has the political tenacity? Obviously, we saw he took a strong decision at a time when maybe it wasn't popular against The Voice. But does he have the guts to, I guess, be that person, be that leader of conviction that we spoke about at the tail end of the Victorian state budget discussion, to really begin to reform the discussion and the commentary that we have about budgets in this country? Of increasing savings measures as opposed to, oh my goodness, the government cut money from education and the NDIS and housing, we must attack them for it, because it just seems to be two different colours and two different parties all cheering for larger government at the end of the day. So yeah, that's an open-ended question, but I guess we'll see, because it's an election year and an election budget, so we'll see.
Yeah, look, I think Angus Taylor, their shadow treasurer, has been running some effective criticism of the budget, Barclay. So I think if you have a look at what Angus Taylor's been saying, I think for every dollar of saving, they've spent another $4 or something. Like he's got some stat like that.
Yep.
So I think he's the one who's really running the criticism. Look, I think that. I mean, really, I think it's a very risky budget for the government. This is a point I made before. I think Jim Chalmers has been too clever by half. He thinks he's got this hack for CPI. He thinks he's hacked the CPI. He's going to push it down, and that's going to convince the RBA to cut rates in time for the election. I'm not sure that's going to happen. We'll just wait and see. I think it's a very risky strategy they're pursuing.
Yeah, so I mean, we disagreed earlier on whether this was an interesting budget or not. That might dictate how we respond to it. I would run with the line similar to what Saxon was saying when he was on here earlier, that the government's gone MIA at making difficult decisions. Like this seems like a tepid non-responses. So they want to talk up tax cuts that were done 2 years ago. Well, if that's the front line of what they've done, they haven't done anything. Then they've done a little cash splash, but it's $3 billion. That's a lot of money for you and I, but it's not ongoing. So they've kind of it's obviously an appeal to try and get reelected. It's not a structural reform. There's really no structural reforms here. There's no attempt to realistically address any of the long-term issues that will eventually have to be addressed. They've put going down. They have government decisions. Accused of being a government that doesn't know what they're doing, that is kind of in the wind without a real agenda, without the guts to make the right decision. They're just sitting there hoping they can give us a few trinkets and buy support for the next election. By the way, just one last comment on a different direction with that. I'm not sure they will go to an election this year. I think they've left themselves open that possibility. I think it'll depend very much on the trajectory of the economy and interest rates.
Yeah.
Like if they realistically think, and this could well be the case, that interest rates are going to drop down in the first quarter of next year, they might want to go immediately after that. You can imagine going to an election immediately after interest rates go down. Alternatively, if they're worried they're going to actually dip into a recession, they might want to go quicker before the recession bites harder. So look, it's possible they'll go this year. I think their hope is that they have walked this line perfectly so that they stay out of recession, inflation comes down by the end of the year, and next year there's a interest rate cut. And then they'll say, we kept us out of recession. We got your interest rates down. We've got your inflation down. And that would be a nice trifecta to take to the election. I mean, I don't know if they'll achieve it, but I think that's their hope, and that's their first plan.
I also had one final thing to add, gents, and maybe it's a point of indulgence, but Q&A. The ABC's Q&A is actually coming to my homestead, or all of our homestead of Queensland, on Monday night, and Jim Chalmers is the special guest speaker. Now, I'll be in the audience, and I might be given the opportunity to ask a question. Now, Gene and John, if you were to be in the audience, I'm wondering what question would you ask our Federal Treasurer, Jim Chalmers? And indeed, if you're in the comments, give us your take or your 2 cents worth. I'll be reading them all. Of what would ask the Treasurer. But Gene and John, is there anything that I should really be grilling the Treasurer about?
If I was in the Q&A audience, the question I'd be asking is, why did I come here? How did I get here, and how can I leave? Like, why do you keep indulging this show? If we all stopped watching, it would go away.
I think it's good. It's good to see the opposition arguments. It's good to see, I think more generally, I mean, maybe you can call this a bit of a cliche response. I think it's good that we have more engagement in the political process in this country. So I kind of like to go to these, public forums. My goodness, the ABC Q&A ratings must be shafted, like completely going down the tubes, because I remember when I was growing up, Q&A used to be at 7 p.m. Now it's at 9:30 p.m. My goodness, the ratings must be dreadful.
Yeah.
As for a question, look, he's just going to pivot every question to a talking point anyway, so I'm not really sure what it would achieve. So you could, I guess you just try and ask a loaded question that is a secret statement hidden as a question. But along the ideas of, well, what would you want to draw? Well, when is stage 4 tax cuts? There you go. So obviously taxes are far too high. Obviously, we've got the highest taxing, highest spending government in Australia's history. Obviously, these high tax rates are holding down productivity. We're in a per capita recession and in a productivity slump. Yeah. So clearly, everyone who loves this country would agree to be cutting taxes. And I know you love this country, Jim. So can you tell us when you're cutting taxes?
Yeah. Well, the other thing, I mean, that's obviously a great point to look towards stage 4 tax cuts. The other thing that plagues my mind is obviously we've got a Dr. Jim Chalmers here, and his doctorate is in the political legacy of Paul Keating. Now, Paul Keating is known as the master of deregulation of the Australian economy. It'd be interesting to see how he reconciles, his worship of Paul Keating as this, bastion of intellectual thought, and how he justifies, big government bureaucracy spending in his time as treasurer so far. But I don't know, do you have anything to add, Gene?
No, I mean, what I'd be asking him, I'd be trying to formulate a question regarding, how does what's been the impact of, measures by this closing loopholes? What does he see as the risks of that to the economy? I mean, we're seeing other jurisdictions that these restrictions or these requirements for minimum payments for Uber drivers and delivery drivers, that's resulting in less work for them. Okay, and various cities. I don't know if it was. I'm trying to remember the exact city, whether it was Seattle or. But these measures are counterproductive. And how does this fit in with the idea of having a dynamic economy? I mean, they talk about a dynamic and competitive economy, except in the largest market we've got, which is the labour market, they don't seem to believe in that. They're going backwards. So how does he reconcile what the government's been doing in IR with his desire for a more dynamic and efficient economy?
Yep.
Yeah, of course, the talking points will be easy there. He just cares about the working man, and you don't. And remember, he gets.
Well, I don't think that's wrong, John. I mean, I think I very much care. I want them to have work.
No, I'm saying that. I'm not saying you don't care. I'm saying that he gets like 10 times longer to answer your question than you get to ask it, and you don't get a point of response. And he'll be on stage, and you're asking him why he doesn't back the unions. He's going to give the cliche because I care about the working man. And so there's not much dodging him on that one. But just don't go, Barclay. Don't indulge the bastards.
Don't
I've noticed, by the way. But good luck with that. Anyway, gents, thanks for showing up. We're getting up to an hour and a half on this one, and I've noticed, as with last time we did this, the number of people watching spikes up at the end when we stop having guests and we stop talking about the budget and we start just talking smack. So I don't know what that tells us. People just prefer looking at our pretty faces rather than listening to us.
I think it's because they prefer the John and Gene show. They don't want intruders. They just want John and Gene.
No, well, like I say, thank you to the senators, to Malcolm Roberts and Matt Canavan for showing up. They are in Parliament House. This is a sitting week. They're doing their work in Parliament, and they ducked in to give us their 2 cents. And thank you to Saxon Davidson from the IPA for showing up, looking very dapper. The best dressed of us today, and raising the point that I think is very important, the lack of a productivity agenda. My short version on this budget, besides the fact that I thought it was boring, is that there's a big deficit. Well, it's a $30 billion deficit, which is bigger than it should be. It's not going to bankrupt the country in the near term, but it's kind of disappointing and irresponsible not to have this budget closer to balanced. So that's, that's a meh. There's they get 1 cross for that. And then microeconomically, it's almost non-existent. There's just a few handouts, a few trinkets. Even their big announcements aren't even really there. They're off budget or off into the future. And there's no real attempt to address any of the issues that I think need to be addressed if you care about the long-term, even medium-term prosperity of this country. So microeconomics, entirely MIA. Macroeconomics, a bit disappointing. That's how I see this budget in summary. Gents, did you want to give one last sentence?
Well, I might actually just take the opportunity to give one final plug. For those listeners who are in Queensland, the ATA are planning on doing a budget summary of the Queensland state budget. It's looking to be in mid-June. We're yet to nail down a date, but it will be in the Brisbane city area. And we'll have a host of guests on, some people from the opposition, some people, that might even be on this call here today. Gene, no pressure on you yet. And of course, John, I hope to see you there as well. So hopefully it'll be a fantastic event, well attended. And we can break down some of the ins and outs of the Queensland state budget. Obviously, comparatively, we have to be in a better position compared to all other states. Obviously, we unpacked the Victorian state budget there in a world of trouble that we did last week. Queensland, it seems they're all just completely masqueraded by the coal royalties, but I won't save I'll save it for our event and obviously our post-budget discussion that we'll be having after the Queensland state budget. So stay tuned for that. And thanks, gents, for a great discussion today.
Yep, thanks, Barclay.
I think we might be one step ahead of you with that event already, but I'll let you know when we're not live. Barclay, thank you very much for coming through again. And Gene, my trusty offsider, thank you once again for showing up. And for everyone at home who's stuck with us this long, thank you for tuning in. And we'll be back sometime soon with another edition of either EconChat or Budget Chat. So for that, signing out. Hey, DJ, what do you think of the budget?
Budget naughty.